G'day everyone. G'day me.
Hello.
Today we've got a real special guest in the form of Daniel Mookhey, who is the New South Wales Treasurer. Welcome, Daniel.
Thanks for having me on. Hello, Shane. Hello, me. Happy new financial year.
That's such a nerdy way to say hi.
That's a good way to say hi. Happy new financial year to you too. We thought we'd start with your background. I mean, what drew you into politics? How did you end up as the State Treasurer?
Well, I've been State Treasurer now for nearly 4 years. I've been a Member of Parliament for 10. I was a nerd at high school who spent a lot of time reading a lot of newspapers and watching the news every night. And I got really interested in public affairs back then. And what really prompted me to get particularly political was when Hawke-Keating lost. And when Hawke-Keating lost, I noticed that Australia was changing. Hawke-Keating and Bob Hawke were the Prime Ministers when I really grew up. And when Mr. Howard came into power, I strongly disagreed with a lot of what he was doing at the time. And so from the lens of a 15-year-old and a 16-year-old, I remember every time Peter Costello would give a budget, I would then rock up to school the next day and tell everybody what was wrong with it, which was not a particularly good way to make friends and influence people at high school, as it turns out. But then I took a real interest in it. And so I joined the Labor Party. I did a law degree. I did an economics degree. And
So it says somewhere you went to a model farm school.
I went to two high schools. So I went to Model Farms High School.
This is in Baulkham Hills.
Sydney's northwest. And then in years 11 and 12, I switched to Girraween High School in Pendle Hill, in Toongabbie, not far from Parramatta, and finished my schooling there. And then I did a law degree and did an economics degree at UTS. And then I was really actually very passionate about the industrial relations world of the labour movement, not so much the political world of the labour movement. So I got out of uni, I got a job, casual member of the call centre at the Transport Workers Union,
Wow.
calling truck drivers and garbage workers and a whole bunch of concrete carters, as well as airport workers, real private sector transport. And I spent 5 years working at the Transport Workers Union. I then went over to a think tank. I actually wrote a few economic papers, particularly about agglomeration economics at Per Capita, a wonderful think tank that we have in Australia. I was at the ACTU for a year for 2013. And then I had a small business for 18 months before I got into Parliament when I was 32.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
It also says here that you're a father of two and an amateur meat smoker and a nerd. What exactly is an amateur meat smoker?
Well, I am quite the fan of charcoal cooking, and often you will find me on weekends smoking various forms of meat. Less time now as treasurer than I used to have, for what it's worth, but that's how I relax. I cook. I do a lot of cooking. And the meat smoking is quite important. I've actually gotten into smoking vegetables, which is harder than smoking meat because you have to cook them slower. They absorb smoke slightly differently. But if you get the flavour right, they're perfect.
So you have a particular barbecue that does
I do, yeah. So there's a couple of things I like. I mean, let's talk about my barbecues. What's called a Kamado smoker comes out of Japan. It's this eggshell thing. They're very popular because they retain heat. In meat smoking world, they're still regarded as sort of your entry level, slightly more advanced than your standard charcoal cooker, but they're not your Texan offset smoker, let alone your Texan offset cold smokers. But from my perspective, when you've got two kids, you actually need to put food on the table. You do need to be able to slightly control the temperature. But because I'm from the north of India, for me, the part of India that I'm from is tandoor cooking. You would know it as tandoori chicken. That type of heat, intense heat, is something that I grew up revering and have spent a lot of time wanting to master. And I'll be honest with you, Shane, when I'm done with this job, I am planning to spend some time in India to properly go into with the tandoor chefs and really figure out how to cook all the naan and cook all the paranthas with the bread in that. And that's the more hardcore stuff that I'm looking forward to getting into.
Would you say that you have the dream job now of delivering your own budget every single year? compared to the days when you were picking out apart Peter Costello's budget?
Well, I got to tell you, there's two things I'll say to that. Firstly, 16-year-old Daniel would be thrilled to be able to give a state budget. And it is a huge honour. And it is, we make spending decisions at roughly $160 billion per year. But actually, because the way in which we budget, which is over 4 years, you're basically making spending decisions that equal $500 billion. So it's very few jobs ever that you get that opportunity. And it's a privilege that the people of New South Wales have granted my party, and which has then given me this role. So I take it really seriously. I should just confess that 43-year-old Daniel has a lot more respect for Peter Costello than 16-year-old Daniel has. Having now sat on this table, on this side of the table, there's still lots of things I wouldn't agree with that Mr. Costello did or proposed, and certainly his successors have. But I have a lot more appreciation for some of the strategy that he employed, because these are really hard jobs, and regardless of whether you're doing it as a Liberal politician or a Labor politician, nation comes first. He made a serious contribution. 43-year-old Daniel would hate what 16-year-old Daniel says, and all of a sudden you're kind of going, hat tip to you, I get how hard the job is.
I really appreciate you saying that. I think, yeah.
There's a lot of economists of my vintage would say that era of Hawke and Keating and Howard and Costello was a sort of a golden era of Australian economic management. It did have a lot of problems, but...
There's not a lot of economists of your vintage who would say that. A lot of economists of your vintage do say that. So
I say that, yeah.
But look, from my perspective, I mean, that era of reform, Hawke, Keating and aspects of Howard and Costello, yeah, definitely will go down in history as one of the great reform eras. I would just say that I think you got to be careful not to look at this in too much rose-tinged eyes. Every reform that they put forward was incredibly intense and struggled against. And it wasn't, although the nation just agreed to it, every single one was hard fought. And the other thing I'd just say as well is, look, a lot of those changes had to take place, but you can only really deregulate the dollar once. You can only really lift tariffs at that scale once and get that big bang. So I feel as though that the reform impulse is always necessary, particularly because Australia is an ambitious country. And this is a country, and Australia is an idea that our future can be better than our past and that we can all collectively work towards it. And from that perspective, I hat tip to those era, but a lot of the solutions there obviously need to be modernised. The way I like to think about it is that we as a nation need to be pretty firm about the destination we want to reach, but pretty flexible about the route.
I mean, it does seem clear to me. There was a lot of low-hanging fruit to summarise what you were saying. So it was, as you say, you can't deregulate or float the Australian dollar twice.
Well, now, Shane, we can nerd out about this. But you would know, for example, that a lot of what Treasurer Keating did was a lot of what Treasurer Howard didn't do. The Campbell report, you really was sitting on the table for 8 years. Actually, the Campbell report, if you go back to the era of Menzies, there were reports calling for the same thing. What I feel like the genius of particularly Paul Keating and Bob Hawke, but particularly Paul Keating, was that they were able to fuse the vision with the politics. That's the hard part of reform. And what they were able to do was really get the compact right. The way I like to think of it is it's not that hard to convince economists what we should do. The harder bit is to build the social consensus around why it needs to be done. But the even harder bit is to make sure that everybody wins from it. And that's the key thing that they got right, in my view, which is we're not just reforming, we're reforming for the many, not the few.
Yeah.
But it's hard to make everyone win from it, though, because I think with reforms, somebody has to suffer in the short term, or maybe everyone wins in the long term.
Well, the short answer is that you often have to confront sectional interest, and you often do have to confront those who win from the status quo and whose privileged position comes from settings that apply today. And when you're doing the work of reform, you're inherently choosing to support a future constituency rather than the ones you're dealing with today. And I just look at this and kind of go, but look, you know, what is interesting particularly about Keating and Hawke is that they pursued the same reforms that people like Reagan and Thatcher did, except for the social compact. Reagan and Thatcher never pursued things like superannuation. They never pursued things like Medicare and accompanied their reforms with it. And I think that what particularly Bob Hawke and Paul Keating got right was that they unleashed the Australian economic engine, but they paired it with such strong institutions, which means that everybody benefits. But the other thing is, it was good economics. I mean, the fact that here today in Australia, here in Sydney, we're in a city that is responsible for managing now $4.5 trillion in superannuation savings is a huge economic reform that happens to be a social reform. I mean, I think that the superannuation reforms especially are probably the best exemplar of what I'm talking about how you can get better capital markets, solve a budget problem, and create a whole bunch of social equity. Final point I'll say about this, Australia is the only country where the cost of the pension is coming down as a percentage of our budget spending. We only spend now 2.8% of our GDP on pensions. There are other countries that are at 9 and 10. And if you want to run a sort of competitive tax system, then that superannuation reform is going to continue to pay dividends for generations to come. All the while, we are now a net exporter of capital. We used to import billions to build the country. We now can fund our own needs, but we're also increasingly funding the world's capital needs as well, all because of the genius of people like Hawke and Keating who were able to fuse reform with equity.
Yeah. I think it was well balanced.
Yeah.
So at that point in time, they could say, well, we've got to do these things over here, which might cause a bit of pain for some people, like in the car industry, for example, or whatever. But we're going to do these things over here, which therefore, as a whole, workers in Australia could see, well, there's a bit of give and take here.
Well, the other thing about that, though, is that the other real architect of all this is Bill Kelty in the Australian Trade Union movement. And the Australian Trade Union movement deserves a lot of credit for this too, because they and still do understand that the worst thing for a worker is inflation. If I as a Labor politician want people's pay to go up, but I want the value of that wage to count when they go to the supermarket. And so understanding that you got to wring inflation out and keep it out, I think has been one of the most seminal sort of forms of reform that took place at that time. But the other thing is, we did it without the social conflict that you saw in places like the UK and in the US, because you had everybody at the table, win or lose.
But maybe there was a situation where these reforms were fairly obvious in the 70s, but the pain hadn't been enough. And so Hawke and Keating come in after another major recession in the early 80s. And at that point in time, everyone wants to try something different, including the union movement. So there was a sort of a constituency to sort of battle inflation, get the wage profit share back into alignment and do all these sorts of things, partly because they'd been through that crisis.
Yeah, and any reform requires a constituency to support it. But that has to be built, that has to be nurtured, that has to be explained, that has to be fought for, that then has to be defended, and then has to be modernised.
Where do you think we are today, though? Because you can make an argument that everyone's a lot more polarised, that it's harder to get different interest groups on side, and you've got social media pulling apart everything you try and do.
I mean, we try to do it with our Make Economics Great Again motto. That's our team's motto. But I do find it a very hard message to deliver, especially to young people, given that people don't really like taking economics nowadays.
Well, there's less people studying. Look at New South Wales high school numbers. There's less.
Economics is number 15 in the list of HSC subjects that people take.
That's still pretty good, by the way. But anyway,
it used to be number 3 in the 90s.
It's just true. But look, there's a few things in that. Firstly, why are you so bleak about our respective profession? But secondly, I do feel that I slightly disagree with you. I see that there's a lot of young people who are very interested in these questions, because a lot of people, we're a very ambitious country, and we've always been a very ambitious country with very ambitious people. But the second thing is look, where do I see this? I think the reality is that it was hard back then too. This is the thing. I'm not convinced it was easier back then. Sure, it's different, but as well. But when we are today, my view is that there are two approaches that we are obviously observing in our country. There are those who wish to use our challenges to build a case for solutions, and there are those who wish to use our nation's challenges to stoke grievance and anger and polarisation.
That seems to be more people than in the past, because they've all got a megaphone via social media.
Yeah.
That they didn't have in the 80s,
True.
for example.
That's absolutely true.
There was media there, but the media wasn't anywhere near as feral, say, as social media.
Well, to be frank, I feel as though the media, what we would describe as the traditional and the conventional media, they're still pretty good and they're pretty balanced. And even those who disagree and agree with us at different times of perspective, I mean, there's a lot more media diversity. I think it's a good thing.
Yeah, yeah.
But I definitely think the importation of these rage for clicks business models that we're seeing coming out of the US is something that isn't welcome. I mean, I think the Premier made this point on another podcast, which is I don't think anyone thinks that Australia is going to be helped by having more US-style politics come here.
That's true. That's true. But where do you, like say in the federal government's tried to do some reform on tax, how do you see that in the context of what's going on? Do you think it would have been, I mean, it's a bit hard for you to comment because they're your colleagues federally.
No. But look, all I'll say is that the federal government's arguing its case, and they should, obviously, and the other side of politics will argue their case because in a democracy, that's how it works. I would just observe that when it comes to the federal government policies, particularly the ones that they announced this year, you can love them, you can hate them. It's entirely fair for people to go at them in different ways, and I don't think that that's a surprise to the federal government whatsoever. Or the only observation that I will make in strong support of what the Treasurer Chalmers has proposed is that no one should think that the system we had before was some Garden of Eden and that the status quo was delivering us the productivity, the innovation, the rise in living standards, because it clearly wasn't. The way I like to say it is that the systems that we had really, when it comes to federal tax policy, were really built for an economy that existed 25 years ago, in the year 2000. And that is when the nation predominantly was making a bit of its money from services, a bit of its money from banking, but still predominantly from what you and I would describe as capital-intensive businesses. Back in 2000, the biggest challenger company in the Australian corporate sphere, I think, was Fortescue, that was raising capital to be able to challenge an iron ore duopoly, as they saw it, in the Pilbara. And the tax system needed to be in a position to support people who would be raising equity, borrowing a lot of money to build really capital-intensive enterprise, expecting to get a return over the next 20 to 30 years. Don't get me wrong, that is still an important part of the Australian economy, but it's no longer the hegemonic part of the Australian economy, because you've got businesses now like Canva, you've got businesses like Atlassian and likes that are global from day one, that are actually quite capital light, that actually trade off the skills of their workforce in global markets. We need a tax system that's capable of supporting both. And my argument has been that the system that we had on May 1, before the federal government announced their changes, wasn't delivering. So credit to Treasurer Chalmers for actually taking up the challenge and going, we've got to change something, because if we don't change something, nothing changes.
Yeah. But a critique may be along the lines of what you're alluding to before with Hawke-Keating, that they did things over here and they did things over here, so you can see losers and winners. Whereas in this case here, it's a bit harder to see the winners. Whereas if you'd announced the changes on budget day and said, oh, but by the way, there's also going to be significant income tax cuts from 2027 onwards or something like that, then I think there may have been more support.
Well, Jim Chalmers did say that there would be tax cuts.
Yeah. Mainly the wage offset.
The more deductions.
Yeah, working Australian tax offset.
It works out to be $22 per week.
Yeah. It's not a lot, but I think it would have been nice to have seen fundamental tax reform at the same time. So you're doing a bit on negative gearing capital gains tax, but you're also doing more to get down your marginal tax rates.
Well, look, all I will observe as a person who also does budgets is that people always look to see whether you can solve every single problem in any particular budget. In my budget that I just gave last week, similarly, people have said, have ventilated various criticisms of my budget as well, which you take with good grace. And all I say is that budgets are important, don't get me wrong, and you always try to make progress on some of the nations and states' problems in each of them, but you don't look to solve everything at once. And I do think Treasurer Chalmers is entitled to continue to keep arguing for his reform agenda. And so I do think that again, I think that doing nothing is not an option. And it's not for me to tell other people how to do their jobs, and it's certainly not for me to tell Treasurer Chalmers how to do his job. But all I will observe is that that progress is possible. Progress is being made. And people are entirely right to go, what would you like to do next and what don't you want us to do next?
Yeah.
I think that particularly, though, no one should think that the system that we have today, the system that we had prior to these changes was delivering us all the productivity. And all I observe about the way in which this debate has taken place is that every single criticism that has been levelled at the federal government is a criticism you could easily level at the status quo as well. And so therefore it's entitled for people to kind of say, well, we've got to do something about this. I saw Treasurer Chalmers up close last year at his economic roundtable, really doing a fantastic job of really bringing together people with quite wildly divergent views. When you have people like the Tech Council sitting in the same room as the Australian Council of Social Services, you'd be surprised how much common ground they ended up having and how astute Treasurer Chalmers was in bringing that together.
Yeah.
So let's bring it a bit closer to home. So what's your own ambition for this year's budget? I heard, your speech, and then you talk a lot about solving the cost of living issues that people are experiencing at the moment.
Yeah.
But what's your ambition this year and the next years as well?
Well, as I was mentioning, the New South Wales budget is a big document. It's $160 billion of expenditure in the next 12 months in Australia's biggest state. And we had a few challenges we were looking to solve or make progress against. The first is make sure we're helping families today. People are going through a pretty acute cost of living crisis as a result of the higher interest rates and the cascading consequences of the latest war in the Middle East, particularly in terms of the oil price. So we're pretty serious about wanting to deliver reform, which is why we had a pretty targeted transport affordability program that discounts the price of people's registration here in New South Wales by $100, make sure that we're freezing prices for public transport, also make sure that we are lowering the toll cap here in New South Wales from $60 to $50 a week. Really practical assistance. First to say it's not going to solve every family's cost of living pressures, but I think every dollar we can provide in short-term relief does help. Second thing that we were pretty focused on is to keep the reform agenda going, because the thing that I hear all the time is that there's no point offering a Band-Aid solution for today if all it means is that you make things worse for tomorrow. So we had to do a few things on the reform side. Firstly, deal with the biggest fundamental reasons why people feel that there are cost of living pressures in the first place in New South Wales, which is the high cost of housing, and continuing on with a pretty ambitious reform agenda when it comes to housing.
Do you think that's, you hear all the states are lagging behind the housing accord?
Yeah.
New South Wales looks to be lagging behind. Is that something, is there going to be sort of a big catch-up?
Well, Shane, they're a stretch goal, and we signed up to them.
No, it's a good stretch goal.
All but knowing that it was virtually
fantastic.
Impossible to hit.
Yeah.
But unless we had that reform impetus, we were not in a position to argue to the people of New South Wales that we've got to build more. And we've seen here in New South Wales, building of new homes peaked back in 2016, 2017, and it's come down. And it actually hit a historic low just when we got elected. And we've had to argue the case pretty relentlessly here in New South Wales that you got to build your way out of this crisis, and you got to build well, high quality homes in neighbourhoods people love, close to public transport. That's been our mantra. What we did report in last week's budget was that for the first time we're seeing a spike, a real turnaround in terms of dwelling investment. That's definitely been challenged with the other gale force winds that are coming, particularly through higher interest rates. So it remains on a watching brief. But I go back to first principles here. If we did nothing would have happened. And from our perspective, we've all got to pull together to build our way out of this housing crisis. We do live in the second most expensive city in the world, if you happen to be Sydney.
I do find it quite hard though, because, this morning I was looking at building approvals in New South Wales, and it's actually down by about 2% year over year. Most other states, except for the ACT, are seeing increases over the year. So I know that New South Wales is a little bit more cyclical, and there are a lot of issues with new dwelling costs, with interest rates, which kind of explain that downturn that we see in building approvals. And another signal that's not very good for the future supply of housing is also the mix of apartments within the mix of building approvals. At its peak, Australia had about half of the building approvals being units and apartments.
This would have been 2015.
Yeah, 2015 to 2018. Right now, it's only about 20-something% among the mix.
It'd be nice to see more apartments in the mix because we can't solve the problem with standalone houses.
Yeah.
Or not in Sydney anyway.
Oh.
Yeah. But I find that very hard because people like you, Shane, that you don't like apartments.
Well, that's a separate
And that's
philosophical.
also a Sydney issue.
I think most Australians would rather have a house, but the reality is if you want to live in Sydney, we're not going to solve it all having a house.
Well, so there's a few things there. The first thing I would say is that actually there are certainly cyclical forces that have a bigger impact on New South Wales than anywhere else. Cost of capital is by far the biggest cyclical factor. But actually we've got a structural problem, which is the structural thing that distinguishes the New South Wales housing market is the fact that our land prices are generally 15% higher than any other state, which means that when you combine the fact that, when you're building a new house or a new apartment, the two biggest inputs by far is the cost of the land and the cost of the construction of whatever you're putting on top of it. We did a lot of deep dive work on this in Treasury. Those two things alone count for roughly 70% of the cost of a new dwelling. But when I talk to you about the land differential between New South Wales and Melbourne is pretty significant. Just the cost of, which makes sense, right? Because we have more people wanting to do more things in Sydney than anywhere else in the country. And I don't disrespect the other states and territories, but there's actually a lot more competition for our land. It's a much more scarce resource here, which you as economists know, people bid it up as a result. And that does mean that if the building approvals affect us. Now, we need interest rate stability, and we have far more of a vested interest in lower interest rates than everybody else because it is such a determinant of economic activity in New South Wales on both the household side and on the capital side. And we were talking about this in our budget last week about what makes New South Wales exceptional is that when the interest rates go up, we feel it differently to every other state. Here's a really simple way to put it. A person who's buying a new home today is likely to borrow about $873,000. In Queensland, that's $736. In Victoria, that's about $680. So the biggest state and the second biggest state, the price differential on a mortgage is more than $150,000. So the same interest rate increase is going to have far more of an impact on gross household disposable income here in New South Wales than elsewhere, which is part of the reasons why we downgraded our consumption forecast a little. As a result, we certainly are paying close attention to the dwelling investments. But the core point that you're making, which is we need everything to go right to get building, 100% true. We do. And the other thing that we're going to have to deal with more and more is that we do need to get more productivity in construction. A typical construction worker today is building roughly the same amount of homes that they were building in 2000. That's actually not a reflection on the construction worker. It's a reflection on the fact that this is an area that needs a lot more innovation and tech, which is part of the reasons why in last week's budget, we made a pretty, what I would say, nerdy announcement that we are going to be wanting to invest in modern methods of construction. The state's prepared to intervene to bring a lot of these technologies that we see out of Sweden and Finland and the Netherlands.
So more modular.
Yeah, construction. But put it this way, right? In Sweden, you're talking about apartments. In Sweden, 95% of 3-story dwellings are built in a factory on modern methods of construction that are then assembled on site. 45% of Sweden's new dwellings of all types come out of this supply chain. We don't have any of that.
So they would just build them in the factory and then bring them on a truck.
Basically, and assemble it on the site. I mean, the loose way of saying it, and this is not disrespectful to anyone, but it's kind of like an IKEA assembly in terms of a house. And high quality, we're talking some of the most best designs. I mean, put it this way, I don't know if you've been to Sweden or Finland. My father-in-law lives in Finland. The designs here are incredible. These are not shitboxes. These are gorgeous places to live. But for the very simple reasons that they're far more replicable because they're using a pattern book, which is what we're using and we want to use. But also you're building indoors. So if it's raining, you don't have to shut down the site.
You can just keep going.
Yeah. You can keep going. So there's a lot of efficiency there. So we think we need to do a lot of this to keep building.
Yeah.
Do you think it's a regulation problem though?
In what respect?
Well, this argument there's more regulation.
Yeah, it takes longer to approve buildings.
Yeah, I do.
There are more
100%.
private tradies to get a license to actually work here.
Look, the short answer is yes. I mean, and we do make building more complex than it needs to be. And that's part of the reasons why we as a new government came in 3 years ago and said, this is crazy. And the planning system is what's holding us back. And therefore, we've spent the last 3 years delivering the biggest shake-up to planning laws in New South Wales, I think, ever. since the acts were really introduced in the 70s. And I think that has been a hugely important signal that we are fixing our administrative apparatus to get people building. I think that's been an issue in the past. I think it's less of an issue. If you talk to the industry, absolutely market forces. It's the cost of interest rates combined with the increased cost of labour.
And just back to the budget a little bit. One of the things that I saw got a lot of praise about the budget is that under your government, the rate of growth in government spending, I mean, it's still there, it's occurring. And you mentioned some of the examples of that has been lower than most other states.
Not all, most other states, all other
states. All of them.
Yeah.
I saw a number 3.6 over 3 years versus 8 point something.
Yeah, I'm very happy to say about that.
Economists kind of like because there's this concern that there's too much government spending. Government spending's risen to record levels, and that's acting as it's using up spare capacity and contributing to the inflation problem.
Yeah.
Whereas New South Wales seems to have avoided that. So have you managed to do that?
Well, it's been hard.
And have a budget that has these cost of living measures?
Well, it's been hard. I mean, the short answer is, I mean, let me reel out some facts for you here. When I became treasurer, I inherited a $15.3 billion deficit on an operating budget at the time, which was roughly $115 billion, which was massive. This was after COVID. This wasn't before COVID. This was effectively my predecessor's pre-election budget. And that was big. And the previous government, in its first 6 years before COVID, their expense growth was averaging 6.4% per year over those 6 years. That is 2012 to 2018. COVID, I'm not going to criticise the Liberal Party for doing what they had to do during COVID, but after COVID, their expense growth rose to 24%, which is what I inherited, which was massive. And that happened to be in the 22-23 budget as well. We made a deliberate decision in our first year that we had a stronger vested interest in getting inflation out and interest rates lower, because that was the best thing we could do to make life more affordable.
So when you came in, that was the high point of the inflation.
Yeah, when I came in, inflation was at 7.8% in Sydney. Sydney CPI was 7.8%. And when you're brought in as a new treasurer, I was shadow treasurer for maybe a year and a half, 2 years before, and they give you the brief and they tell you this is what not so much what they're experiencing, but this is what they're expecting, and you got to set a fiscal strategy. First thing the Premier and I said, the best thing we have to do for working families is to get inflation down and do our bit, which is why we then sort of said, well, we're going to be pretty disciplined about every dollar that we're spending. So we have, and in our last three budgets, I can report to you that we've delivered expense growth of 3.6%. That's not forecast, that's delivered. And we are forecasting over our forward estimates 2.7%. Why does that matter? It matters because for the reason you just said, which is we want to make sure that it's not just mortgage holders that are doing all the heavy lifting in the country to get inflation out by having to pay higher mortgage rates and having less money to spend. And given that I'm responsible for an economic entity that, depending on how you count it, is either the biggest spender in the Australian economy or the second biggest spender after the federal government, I take it really seriously. So we've made our contribution to trying to get inflation out. Same time, we've been able to deliver people, particularly our essential workers, some pretty big pay increases as well, which I know some economists criticise as well, and they don't subscribe to.
So at the upper level, there's been constraints though.
Yeah, but
senior levels, but down below. And you've
actually,
cut some
it's been reform. We also had a really wrenching and really tough debate last year about workers' compensation costs here in New South Wales, in which we argued that the system was failing injured workers, it was failing taxpayers and failing businesses. But we got on with the job of reforming it, which is not my way of saying this is just simple cuts or, my God, we're just restricting a few areas for a while. We've been dealing with the systemic forces in the New South Wales budget that were wasting people's money and needed to be fixed. Yeah. And that's why we were able to afford to fund our priorities, but also keep our spending under control.
I really like that direction that we're going in. Before we let you go, do you think that the common Australian supports that? You know, we cut back government spending and cut back expenses? Because it does seem like, you know, as a young person browsing TikTok every day, it does seem like everyone's asking more and more of the government every single day. They have to pay more for health. They have to pay more for this and that. And I do feel like, you know, at AMP, we always thought that grievance has fueled the rise of more extremist or populist parties, not just in Australia, but globally as well. Any thoughts on that?
I'll tell you this, right? There's one thing I've learned as treasurer, and I'll let you know a secret. It's this. It's that everybody thinks everybody else should pay more tax and they should pay less.
That is true.
They get the benefit.
And everybody else thinks that the government should spend money on their priorities, and everybody else's priorities isn't something that they support, which is what I describe as the wonderful and dynamic forces of a rich democracy in which we live as well. But no, my answer to that is that I think that what distinguishes us from countries like the US is that we believe in ambition, we believe in aspiration, but we also believe in fairness. And we would not be prepared to tolerate the levels of brutality in the US labour market or US healthcare. I don't think any Australian's up for American-style healthcare. And I don't think any Australians are up for the American-style wage system in which you're basically paying people on tips. But the difference as well is that equally, I don't think Australia is up for some of the models that we see in Europe as well, in which, particularly in the Nordic countries, in which you do run government as a bigger share of the economy than where we are now, nearly half as well. I think people we're an ambitious country and we're a fair country, and I think there's always going to be tensions between those two parts of our national character. But I think the way in which we resolve them has traditionally been pretty healthy and pretty constructive. And so no doubt the voters get to decide who their politicians are. There are going to be a slew of voters who will go for other parties and do want forms of change. It's not for me to judge them. It's for me to make our argument as to why I think my party has better ideas and better solutions, and I'll leave it to other parties to argue their cause.
Yeah. Do you think it's getting harder, though, for centrist parties, like Labor, obviously for Liberals recently? You know, as social media has sort of come along, magnifies grievance, and then it maybe attracts people to more populist parties that are further to the right or further to the left.
Well, I don't know, Shane, is the honest answer. All I'll observe is that in my profession, you can either harness these social energies for good or for less good. Ultimately, it's for the voters to decide where they stand on what people are proposing. But from my perspective, I am hopeful about our country. I'm hopeful about our state. And I think that we've already experienced a lot of challenges and setbacks, and I think that we've already lived through, in the last 10 years especially, a huge amount of complexity, and we've actually pulled through. And I think that what I think is good about Australian politics is that we don't make it the core of our lives, and we don't, we don't decide which sport clubs we go to or who our kids play with according to who their parents vote for. And I think that's a really good thing.
I love that. We should end on a good note. It's very refreshing to actually hear a politician ending a podcast on a good note rather than something gloomy and, terrible.
I'm sorry
bad news.
that my profession is so bleak. So I'm glad I could
I'm
exceed your
really glad to have
expectations.
you here because we do like to end it on a positive note. I do think that Australia has a lot of potential here. We do have a lot of competitive advantages, and there's definitely potential for us to outperform over the longer term if we have the right kind of regulations and institutions for that.
Yeah, well, what a pleasure to join you here for your podcast.
It's been fun.
so much.
Thank you.